Hey everyone, my name is Kay, and this is Dark Tales from the Road. Thank you all so much for listening today. I apologize for the delay in this episode. I have been battling some bad allergies, if you cannot tell by my voice, so I put off recording for way too long and now I'm behind. So I apologize greatly, but thank you all for hanging in there with me. So today we're going to journey to New Hampshire. We will be in the town of Kensington, and we are going to look over the Exeter Incident. It is about a UFO incident, and I thought it was really interesting because it's one of, they'll say it in the articles that I read, it's one of like the most well documented, other than like Roswell, New Mexico. And it doesn't get the same attention as Roswell, but it's still super interesting. So I'm very excited about it. If you're new here, I like to start with history. I love history. I love learning. So I am going to talk about New Hampshire, just a snippet of their history. I'm going to talk a little bit about Kensington. It's a nice small town. But then we will jump right into our subject after that. This may be a little bit longer episode. I just found so much stuff that I wanted to include in here. So I hope you like it, and let's go ahead and get started. So New Hampshire, in that area, the first people that were there, it was around the city of Keene, New Hampshire, and this was about 13,000 years ago, was the Native American tribe, the Abenaki. I believe I said that correctly, and they were called the people of the Dawn Land. Then comes along the Europeans, as usual, that decide to settle in New Hampshire in the early 17th century. So they were living peacefully with the Native Americans, but as we know, every episode, things get bad and the settlers actually start stealing from them, capturing them, and selling them into slavery. In addition to that, these Europeans brought diseases, and so there was a huge smallpox epidemic from 1615 to 1620, and then another one in 1633. It literally wiped out 90% of the Native American population in New Hampshire. The Native Americans eventually fled, especially to Canada, because more and more villages were popping up around New Hampshire, and a lot of the population actually settled north into Canada, especially St. Francis, Quebec. That was a big area for them. In 1623, a man named John Mason, he was an English merchant, he received a land grant in New England and sent other mariners to go set up base camps for fishing and trading in the New Hampshire and New England area. He was the one who named the area New Hampshire after his home country of Hampshire, England. Another man, David Thompson, created a settlement at Odier's Point. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry if I butchered that. But eventually that point was abandoned. And then more and more fishing merchants are coming in from London, like the men Edward and William Hilton. They established the first permanent settlement in New Hampshire at Dover, which is now the 7th oldest continuous settlement in the U.S. And also, John Mason, the English merchant who came at the beginning, he established the town of Portsmouth, which is the state's capital. 1679 was when New Hampshire was given the title of a royal province, and then it became a part of the Massachusetts colony from 1698 to 1741. After that, it became a British province again, and so through all of that, France and Great Britain are trying to figure out the ownership of the land in the New World, and that's what came about the French and Indian War, and they succeeded in literally pushing out all of the Native Americans from that area. 1763, Great Britain won over the territory, and the British government then set up land grants to attract settlers to move to New Hampshire. It was one of the 13 original colonies that was a huge part of the fight for independence from England. December 13th, 1774, 4 months before his famous, quote, midnight ride to Lexington, Massachusetts, Paul Revere embarked on a 55-mile ride from Boston to Portsmouth to warn Fort William about British troops coming. It was one of the first acts of rebellion that led up to the Revolution. And so over 400 of the townspeople responded by raiding garrisons for gunpowder to really prevent the takeover. They lowered the British flag and everything when they got to Portsmouth. 1776, New Hampshire was the first colony to declare its independence from England and the first colony to have its own constitution. Throughout the Revolutionary War, tons of colonists were being sent in because they were critical for troops and supplies. Like the Battle of Bunker Hill, nearly all of the colonist troops who fought there were from New Hampshire. And again, they played an important role during the Battle of Bennington in 1777, which was a huge victory for the colonists. At the end of the war, New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify the state constitution. They were the 9th and the last. They were the deciding state to ratify the Constitution. So then June 21st, 1788, New Hampshire became this 9th state in the Union. It's so crazy seeing the 17 in there when a lot of the states that we do on the West Coast and everything that was way later on in the 1800s. So the history up in that New England area is just insane. When it came time to establish the United States government, New Hampshire residents were a huge part of that. A man named John Langdon, he was the first acting vice president, and he was also the first president of the Senate, and this was all during George Washington's first term. That's pretty cool. Another man named Samuel Shelburne, he became the first Attorney General of the United States. So always have to talk about slavery in the Civil War. So slaves were brought to Portsmouth by the British in 1645. There were very few slaves that lived in New Hampshire, but by the time of the Revolution, there were about 700 Black people living in the state at the time, and some were a part of a very free society. Slavery was then abolished in New Hampshire in 1857. Immigration is huge there. Obviously, they pushed and pushed to get settlement there. A lot of the immigrants were Scottish and Irish who came around 1719 and planted the first potato crops in North America. Textiles were also a huge part of New Hampshire's economy, especially in the 19th century, because it really attracted French Canadian workers from Quebec and New Brunswick, and about 900,000 French Canadians actually came to the U.S. between 1840 and 1930. And so as of 2021, the 20% of New Hampshire's population is still of French ancestry. And I wanted to mention the Shakers. So coming into New England, we talk about the Quakers. And they're also known as the French Camisards. I'm sorry. They were a huge part of the formation of the Protestant part, and they were called the United Society of Believers in Christ's second appearing in New England. That is just a long name. This was in 1747, and they were also known as the Shaking Quakers, or simply Shakers, due to their euphoric dancing. If you want to know more about them, definitely look them up. I found such a long explanation, but they were very much they shook things up too when it came to democracy and how they wanted to live and saw the world. So, few interesting facts here to finish out New Hampshire. The state's motto is live free or die. And that has to do a lot with the spirit of independence in that area. The state of New Hampshire is a huge part of national elections. We all hear about New Hampshire deciding things, and it was the first state to hold national primaries. And its primary election is such a huge influence to the rest of the nation, which blows my mind. New Hampshire is so tiny. And so there is actually a saying that says, quote, as New Hampshire goes, so goes the nation. There's a place where the White Mountains and the famed Mount Washington, in that area is actually the windiest place in the nation. New Hampshire is actually home to the first American astronaut, Alan Shepard Jr., and to Krista McAuliffe. She is a civilian, and they were both to travel to space. So for Shepard, he had a 15-minute flight on board Freedom 7 on May 5th, 1961. They launched him 116 miles into the atmosphere before landing safely. McAuliffe, if you remember the Challenger expedition, she was a school teacher from Concord who applied to participate in the mission. She and the rest of the crew aboard the Challenger space shuttle, they all perished January 28th, 1986. They only made the trip for 73 seconds and 48,000 feet after liftoff. And if you're not familiar with it, the rocket completely exploded, killing all of them. It's very, very sad. There's a really good documentary about it. I believe it's on either HBO or Netflix, but it's really good. It's very sad too. So, July 1944, there were financiers from 44 countries that gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel, and this was for the Bretton Woods International Monetary Conference. This is where the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were established, and the American dollar was then designated as the standard for international exchange. New Hampshire is one of only 9 states that does not require its residents to pay state income tax. Montana, actually, you don't have to pay sales tax. Just a couple more here. So New Hampshire is the only state to have hosted the conclusion of a foreign war. So in 1905, the treaty ending the Russo-Japanese War was signed in Portsmouth. The first modern free American public library was established in Peterborough, New Hampshire in 1833. Sorry, my voice is a mess and I'll have to pause to drink water, cough, whatever. I'll cut those out though, I promise. And last year, Franklin Pierce was born in New Hampshire. He was a member of the United States Senate and House of Representatives before he became president from 1853 to 1857. So going into the town of Kensington, I have a very small blurb. It has its history, it really does, but it was a lot about the ups and downs of farming and factories and all these things about it, but it's still very small. It's only about 2,000 people. It was incorporated in 1737, and it survives on farming and little bit of industry that they have there. The first Memorial Day, or what they also call Decoration Day, was first held in Kensington in 1878, where they placed flags on graves of all of the soldiers. And by like the 1890s and 1900s, a lot of the shops in the area closed and farming started to decrease, but it is still a big farming area. But they are dependent on the surrounding towns for work and shopping. There's a lot of small towns like that. So this is where it took place in Kensington, outside of Exeter, New Hampshire. So that's the little bit I have on Kensington. So we're going to get started because I do have a lot. So, ouch, sorry. If you haven't heard of the Exeter Incident, or it's known as the incident at Exeter, it was very publicized. It's a UFO sighting. It occurred September 3rd of 1965. So it is old. So I've heard of it because I like creepy stuff. I like UFO stuff. So I've always heard of it, along with Roswell and some other more well-known ones. But it was a long time ago. So don't feel like, oh my gosh, I've never heard of this one. That's okay. I'm here to tell you about it. So it was about 5 miles or 8 kilometers south of Exeter, New Hampshire, in the town of Kensington. There were actually a lot of sightings being called in by a lot of different witnesses weeks before the actual incident had happened. But on September 3rd, that became the most famous eyewitness sighting, that it was about a local teenager and 2 police officers. So here's what happened. September 3rd, 1965, at approximately 2 a.m., 18-year-old Norman Muscarello, was hitchhiking to his home in Exeter along the New Hampshire Route 150. So he graduated from high school 3 months earlier and was 3 weeks away from leaving for service for the Navy. He was visiting his girlfriend at her parents' house, which was near Amesbury, Massachusetts, and he didn't own a car. So he would hitchhike to and from Amesbury, which was about 10 miles or 16 kilometers. And like nowadays you think about that and you're like, oh my gosh, why would you hitchhike 10 miles? You'll get kidnapped, you'll get killed. Like, now it's a huge stigma to do something like that, but it was the 60s, very, very different times. So, just so you know. So he's hitchhiking, but it's 2 a.m. in the morning. There's very little traffic happening, so he actually had to walk most of that distance. Once he got to Kensington, he noticed 5 flashing bright red lights in the distance. And so he thought it might be a police car or a fire engine, but he got closer to the lights and he could see that they were actually hovering in the air just above the trees and illuminated the field and 2 houses in the area with bright, bright red light. One house belonged to the Dining family. They were not home at the time, and the other to the Russell family. So Norman thought that the object was about 80 to 90 feet in diameter, which is 24 to 27 meters. He was terrified, freaked out. It made no sound and then started to move towards him. And so he was panicking. He actually dived into a ditch beside the road. Then all of a sudden the lights started to change direction and hovered over the Dining family farmhouse. So Norman ran to the Russell's house. He started pounding on the door and yelling for help, but no one answered it. The Russells actually said later on that they heard Norman at the door, but they were too frightened to open it. So the object actually moved away and disappeared into the nearby woods. So he actually saw the headlights of an approaching car, ran into the road and forced it to stop. And it was a couple in the car. And so they drove Norman to the Exeter police station. Once they got there, he was visibly shaken, very, very pale. And he told his story to an officer named Reginald Toland. He worked the night desk there. So Toland knew Norman and was taken back by his obvious fear and his genuine agitated state. So Toland radioed police officer Eugene Bertrand, and he had actually passed a woman on the highway, and she was extremely distressed. She was just sitting in her car on NH 108. And so he stopped and asked if she was okay. And the woman told him that there was a huge object with flashing red lights, and it had followed her in her car from Epping, which is 12 miles away or 19 kilometers away, and just hovered over her car before flying away. Officer Bertrand didn't think anything of it, thought her kind of crazy, and he did stay with her for about 15 minutes until she calmed down and she was ready to drive away. So once he got to the police station and started hearing Norman's story, he decided to drive to the dining farm with Norman to investigate with him the field where the lights were seen. So driving him back there to the sighting, in his car, they saw nothing unusual driving up, But once they exited the car and they walked into the field, especially towards the woods where Norman had first seen the lights, there were some horses nearby in a corral that were kicking the fence and the sides of barns so loud. They were so frightened, and there were tons of dogs in the area that were barking and howling. So all of a sudden, they're standing there, and the object rises slowly from the trees, and Officer Bertrand describes the UFO as, quote, this huge dark object as big as a barn over there with red flashing lights on it. So it was extremely silent when it started to move towards them, and it would sway back and forth. So, knowing his police training, Officer Bertrand, he dropped to one knee, drew his revolver, and pointed at the object. But then he decided that shooting it would probably not be a wise decision. So he put his revolver away, he grabbed Norman and ran back to the patrol car. He radioed another policeman named David Hunt to come assist him, and while they waited in the car for Hunt to arrive, they continued to watch this object in the sky. So there's a UFO historian named Jerome Clark. He says that Officer Bertrand and Norman, quote, observed the object as it hovered 100 feet away, and at 100 feet altitude, it rocked back and forth. The pulsating red lights flashed in rapid sequence from right to left, then left to right, each cycle consuming no more than 2 seconds. The local animals continued to act agitated. So once Officer Hunt arrives, it's still there, and he's watching it happen. So finally, it rose above the trees and completely disappeared. Then Officer Hunt heard the engines of a B-47 bomber because it also flew overhead. And so a journalist, John G. Fuller, he says, quote, you could tell the difference between UFO and the bomber. There's no comparison. So all three men drove back to the police station and immediately started filing separate reports of what they saw. And then Officer Bertrand took Norman home and told his mother about it. This blew up and got national publicity. So Fuller, who I mentioned earlier, the journalist, he was a regular columnist for the Saturday Review. And so he was in Exeter investigating the sightings, and he interviewed a ton of the people in the area who also had claimed to have witnessed the strange lights and the unusual objects. Another journalist, his name is Ron Smith, he was actually a senior at Exeter High School who had talked to Fuller, the journalist, about how 2 or 3 weeks after Norman's sighting, he was traveling in a vehicle with his mother and aunt around 11:30 in the evening, and he said his mother and aunt and him saw an object with, quote, a red light on top and bottom was white, and it glowed, and it appeared to be spinning. It passed over their car, and when it passed over it and got in front of it, it stopped mid-air, then went back over the car again. It's crazy. So for the journalist Fuller, he also spoke to the police officer, Officer Toland, who initially had talked to Norman at the police station, and he told Fuller that a number of calls had come in from the Exeter area residents regarding this sighting. And one of the examples was he had heard from Mrs. Ralph Lindsay. He says, quote, she called in here early, just before dawn. She said it was right out her window as she was calling. It was like a big orange ball, almost as big as the harvest moon, and it wasn't the moon either. All the time she was talking to me, her kids were at the window watching. Now, why would people go to all the trouble, people all over the area, if they weren't seeing something real? When the police chief read the reports of Officers Bertrand and Hunt and Norman, he called the Pease Air Force Base and reported the UFO sighting. And so the Air Force sent Major David Griffin and Lieutenant Alan Brandt to come and interview the three men. So they asked the men not to report their sightings to the press. But a reporter from Manchester Union Leader newspaper had already interviewed them. So Major Griffin, he sent a report of the incident to the staff at what's called Project Blue Book. It's the official Air Force research group assigned to investigate UFO reports. Major Griffin wrote, quote, at this time I have been unable to arrive at a probable cause of this sighting. The three observers seem to be stable, reliable persons, especially the two patrolmen. I viewed the area of the sighting and found nothing in the area that could be the probable cause. Pease Air Force Base had 5 B-47 aircrafts flying in the area, but I do not believe that they had any connection with the sightings. So before Project Blue Book sent this evaluation to the Pentagon, the Air Force had already issued an explanation of Norman's and the police officers' sightings to the press. They told the reporters that the three men had seen, quote, nothing more than stars and planets twinkling owing to a temperature inversion. Okay. Then Project Blue Book came in and issued their own explanation, stating that it's, quote, Operation Big Blast, a SAC NORAD training mission, and that a lot of B-47s were active on the night of this sighting, and that is what they could account for as the UFO. One of the supervisors, U.S. Air Force Major Hector Quintanilla, he wrote to the officers Bertrand and Hunt and said, quote, in addition to aircraft from this Operation Big Blast, there were also 5 B-47 aircrafts flying in your area during this period. Since there were many aircrafts in the area at the time, there were no reports of unidentified objects from personal engagement in the operation. We might then assume that the objects you observed between midnight and 2 a.m. might be associated with this military operation. Quintanilla also added that, quote, if however these aircrafts were noted by either of you, this would tend to eliminate the air operation as the possible explanation for the objects observed. So then here comes Norman and the officers strongly disagreeing with the Air Force. They sent a letter to Project Blue Book and they said, quote, as you can imagine, we have been the subject of considerable ridicule since the Pentagon released its final evaluation of our sighting September 3rd, 1965. So the patrolman and Norman, they saw this object close range. They knew what happened. They were there with each other. They all had the same story, all the details down, and they knew it was not just a conventional aircraft. They knew it had nothing to do with weather. It was completely clear. There was no wind, no chance of a weather aversion, and what they saw was in no way a military or a civilian aircraft. Officer Bertrand also said that the UFO sighting was nearly an hour after Operation Big Blast was said to have ended. So that completely eliminates the possibility of the sighting. Project Blue Book did not respond to their letter. And so on December 29th, 1965, 4 months after the sighting, the men sent another letter to Project Blue Book, and they wrote that the object that they observed, quote, was absolutely silent with no rush of air from jets or chopper blades whatsoever, and it did not have any wings or tail. It lit up the entire field, and 2 nearby houses turned completely red. And the journalist John Fuller, we talked about earlier, also ridiculed the Air Force explanation in print. He wrote that he had observed an unusual object near Exeter himself and that it was being chased by an Air Force jet fighter. Raymond Fowler, he's New England investigator for the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, also a very long name. He filed a very detailed report on the Exeter sightings. In his view, the Air Force explanation is also incorrect because the Air Force is still claiming that these UFOs that people had saw were merely lights from nearby Pease Air Force Base. So they tried to prove it. They had the lights activated before a very large crowd that had gathered quite a distance away. So Fowler says, quote, he ordered personnel at the base to turn the lights on. Everybody looked and waited and nothing happened. Frustrated, he yelled into the mic to turn on the lights. A voice replied that the lights were on. The very embarrassed officer slunk back into the seat of his staff car and drove off amongst the laughs and cheers of the crowd. January 1966, Lieutenant Colonel John Spaulding, he was from the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force, he finally replied to their letters they sent in. And he wrote that, quote, based on additional information submitted to our UFO investigation officer, Wright Patterson at Air Force Base, Ohio, we've been unable to identify the object you observed on September 3rd, 1965. So these UFO sightings with Norman and officers Bertrand and Hunt, they actually remain among the most well-documented and publicized in UFO history. So 1966, Fuller, the journalist that we talked about, he actually published an account of his investigation into the case. He entitled it Incident at Exeter and actually made the New York Times bestseller list. Norman, who insisted to the day that he died that he witnessed was real and not an ordinary object. He actually died in April of 2003 at age 55 from an illness, and then Officer Bertrand died in 1998 and Hunt in 2011. So Project Blue Book is literally a compilation of the government trying to refute the existence of extraterrestrial objects. A man named Peter Jeremiah, maybe. He is the New Hampshire State Director of the Mutual Unidentified Flying Object Network. I really want to be a part of that. He noted, quote, the police officers involved put their careers on the line. They courageously came forward and stated what they saw at a time when witnesses were not allowed any credibility on the subject. He actually appeared in the national media. Jeremiah did. He said, including going on to Unsolved Mysteries, where he presented the chronology that was depicted and what happened the night of the incident in Exeter. And his rendition actually corresponds perfectly with Norman's sighting that night. There were a lot of secondhand speculations that came about and really varied when it came to the hypothesis of what happened. Norman's mother actually saw, supposedly, confidential drawings of a UFO landing site pattern that was displayed, I guess, when an Air Force investigator visited her house. And the neighboring farmers were actually told by the Air Force to make sure to plow under landing marks in their field. So, cover up? Yes. They even said that the hens in the neighborhood stopped laying eggs completely, and they saw an airbase intelligence officer actually buying up all the newspapers that carried the story about September 3rd. And a base commander was seen in civilian clothes rather than uniform while investigating. Then comes the irrefutable. So there were a lot of similarities with these sightings that really conform to documented cases. So UFOs tend to be seen near swamps or major power lines, nuclear sources, and Norman noticed that the object coming from over a line of trees behind which there was a major power line and a swamp in the area. So Pease Air Force Base and the Navy Yard both had nuclear power entities. And when Pease Air Force Base commander attempted to disprove that it was a UFO by simulating the incident by turning on the runway lights, he failed. So very interesting. I have an article here. I cut a bunch out of the article. It was extremely long, but it also went over everything I just said. So I'm going to read it. So I've kind of paraphrased it. I'm not going to read it and quote it word for word. I just have taken out certain parts. So the article is actually called Exeter Incident Solved. It says a classic UFO case 45 years cold. So men named James McCanna and Joe Nickel, they are who wrote this and have had a huge impact on it, and talks about a lot of the proposals of what it could have been and what was written and all this stuff. So this is by them. And again, they consider this account to be one of the best documented UFO account on record. They also say, quote, it's one of the most spectacular and best corroborated UFO close encounters of all time. So over the next several weeks after the incident, there were some 60 reports of UFOs followed in the area around Exeter, and it resulted in tons of articles. There were entries in the UFO encyclopedia. There were tons of discussions in books, as well as lectures, radio shows, and television documentaries. And the Pentagon actually admitted that they had no explanation of what happened. So here are some of the proposals that these guys had talked about. And I am going to quote these word for word from the article just so I get all their details correct. So, first one, quote, astronomical bodies. The Pentagon considered and rejected the possibility of astrostars or planets. Supposedly, the witnesses had merely seen stars and planets twinkling due to a temperature inversion, which is a meteorological phenomenon in which a layer of warm air is trapped above a cold night air and thus is capable of causing visual distortions. The totality of evidence was incompatible with the hypothesis, which led to declare the astronomical evaluation as completely unattainable. Another quote, glare of airport landing lights. One Air Force officer hypothesized that the Exeter sighting merely resulted from the glare of landing lights at nearby Pease Air Force Base, a Strategic Command SAC NORAD bomber base. The possibility was tested by having both the runway marker lights and the approach strobes turned off and on during a 15-minute period, but observers saw no effect from the Exeter site. Another here, quote, an Air Force operation. Blue Book suggested the incident might have been caused by planes from SAC NORAD training exercise dubbed Big Blast, which occurred on September 2nd and 3rd of 1965. Blue Book noted that the, quote, the town of Exeter is within the traffic pattern utilized by air traffic control in the recovery of these aircraft at Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire, end quote. The exercise was active, according to the Blue Book's chief Quintanilla, between midnight and 2 a.m. However, Officer Bertrand noted that he and young Norman Marcello had witnessed the flashing UFO. nearly an hour after 2 a.m., which would eliminate the Air Force Operation Big Blast as an explanation. Another, quote, advertising plane. Newspapers in the Exeter area ascribed to the lights to a flying billboard, an ad plane owned by the Skylight Aerial Advertising Agency of Boston. The Amesbury News thus claimed the UFO has finally been identified, but alas, the plane was on the ground between August 21st and September 10th, and furthermore, it bore no red lights, instead having a rectangular sign carrying white flashing lights. Another here, quote, corona discharge from power lights. The late UFO skeptic Philip J. Klass agreed that the eyewitnesses had indeed seen something unusual, but he speculated that, quote, the Exeter UFOs, including the ones seen by Muscarello and the two police officers, might have been power line coronas, that is, clear weather plasmas, luminous clouds of ionized air that were generated by electrical charges emanating from high-tension power lines. This clearly did not explain the original Exeter incident, and Klass later backed away from his plasma UFO theory. Another one, quote, prank with lighted kite. Skeptical UFO buff Mark Cottemeyer weighed in with the notion that a prankster flew a kite, most likely a large box kite with 5 strobe flashers linked to a sequencer, that hung along the kite line rather than a tail, thus accounting for the observed 60-degree angle. However, not only is the kite hypothesis cut from whole cloth, but the imagined prankster seemed to have gone to considerable effort for such a deserted place and time. There still are other objects, still other possible candidates were proposed. A helicopter, balloon, civil plane, but nothing seemed likely. So they go on to talk about perceptions, and I just thought this was really interesting. So I'm going to also quote this part word for word. So, quote, people misperceive, especially when they suddenly encounter something that is unknown, is seen under adverse conditions and frightens them. Recall that at Exeter, the unidentified lights were so bright that witnesses could not make out the shape of the UFO. Not knowing the craft's size, its altitude, or its distance from the viewer, that is, with multiple unknowns, a witness has no basis for estimating any of these factors. And Exeter witnesses were indeed afraid. A woman who felt she was being chased by the UFO had pulled off the road. A teenage witness arriving at the police station was white and shaking, and one officer admitted he almost shot at the bright lights. Consider that even something as distant as a meteor hundreds of miles away, passing out of sight behind trees, can seem to have landed in a nearby woodland, a common illusion. The brightness of the Exeter UFO's lights, greater than that of a mere airplane and ultimately providing a clue to its identity, probably made the craft seem much closer than it really was. Consider, too, that something that is frightening tends to loom large in one's consciousness. Chad Marsalek of the University of Minnesota, an expert in memory distortion, describes a weapon focus effect. This may cause an eyewitness who is focusing on something frightening, such as the barrel of a gun, to lose focus on other elements. As it happens, when people view a disturbing image, they tend to be confident of their accuracy, even when their memory is wrong. All of these issues apply to the Exeter incident. However, much of the eyewitnesses described was still accurate, as well as we all see. An article written in Skeptical Inquiry, and this was their explanation for what happened in Exeter. This is the last part I'm going to talk about of the incident, and then I have a little bit more, and I'm almost done. So they say, quote, a KC-97 at right with refueling boom extended and 2 A-7 aircrafts. This is what their theory is about. In 2011, Joe Nickel, a prominent skeptic, and James McGaha, who I talked about earlier, a retired Air Force major, proposed a possible explanation for the incident in the Skeptical Inquirer. As a pilot, McGaha had been refueled in flight by KC-97 tracker aircraft like the ones stationed at Pease Air Force Base near Exeter in 1965. In the article, he claimed to have recognized the flashing red light pattern reported by the witnesses 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. According to Nickel and McGaha, before refueling, the underbelly of the KC-97 tankers flash 5 very bright red lights in the same pattern. The refueling boom hung down at 60-degree angle and would flutter in the air currents when not being controlled by the boom operator, like from a witness statement. So that is what they're saying. They're saying, I put a picture in my notes just to make sure. So they're saying these two A7 aircrafts, pretty small compared to the KC-97, which is a refueling plane. They're saying that the boom came out to refuel these planes and it had the same light pattern. That is their explanation. They believe they've solved it. I don't agree. I totally believe in UFOs. I totally believe in life beyond this planet. And so for me, that doesn't do it. With the eyewitnesses, and there's so many more like that we don't know the stories to, I do not believe this is what happened. But you guys make your own opinion. And last here is a very cute article. And I'm going to read it word for word also because it is about the Exeter UFO Festival, which, man, I need to go. The Exeter UFO Festival that runs through this weekend, sorry I didn't look the dates up, brings together a gathering of notable UFOologists, true believers, skeptics, and the merely curious to raise money for kids' charities and talk about what the heck happened that night. Bill Smith, president of the Kiwanis Club of the Exeter area, said the festival was a brainchild of Dean Merchant, a Kiwanian and the UFO enthusiast and researcher. Quote, he just was fascinated as to just what happened 50 years ago, Smith said. He was saying, nobody talks about it anymore. Nobody recognizes the significance of this event anymore. The Exeter Festival is still, at its heart, a fundraiser for children's charities supported by the Kiwanis. It's not the biggest affair that draws thousands each year like Roswell, New Mexico, where the 1947 crash of a flying object ignited a still-burning debate over the existence of extraterrestrial life. It attracts 600 to 700 people who buy little green aliens, spaceships, t-shirts, coffee mugs, and hot dogs, and you also get to hear from UFO researchers. The event is family-friendly and geared for fun, but Smith cautions that there is a line between having fun and poking fun. A large percent of the audience are true believers, he said. They do take it seriously. Not everybody does, he said. Quite frankly, we'll get people who aren't happy about this. They'll say, do you really believe in this stuff? There's still some of that. Not as much as in the past when they'd say, man, you guys are a bunch of whack jobs. So that is the Exeter UFO Festival. Sounds amazing. I could go on and on for days about this because I found so much information. So I encourage you guys to look up this interview. So it is actually a student that interviews Norman, and it's originally published in the Talon Exeter Area High School newspaper. And it's long because they're interviewing him, so he's going over his story again. They're asking a ton of questions, and it goes into a huge detail about what happened. So it's called, when I Googled Exeter Incident, it came up with the article. It's titled Norman Muscarello Recalls His UFO Incident at Exeter. And so it is a student that is talking with him. It looks like it was also published on seacoastnh.com. So I highly encourage you guys, if you want to know more, if you want to go in more details on the eyewitness account, definitely check that out. So this was not as long as I thought it would be. I am very sorry. I probably rushed through it, but my throat is so dry and I'm stuffy and I'm sorry. But thank you all for listening today. I greatly appreciate it. You guys have no idea, and thank you for your patience on getting this one out. The Zodiac bonus episode for Gemini, it was supposed to be on Tuesday, and everything just fell through, and feeling sick, just allergies, I'm getting killed this year. And being super busy, I'm about to have surgery in a couple weeks, so life is a little crazy right now, but the Gemini episode will be posted tomorrow, and then join us next week. We're going to be heading to Mississippi to a very, very haunted area, and I'm so excited about it. Then after that, episode 50 is our 50th state. And so I'm done traveling the United States. I do want to go international. I want to do so much more. I have so many ideas, but I'm going to do a series on political cults, political groups that we're going to be talking about. So some examples is the Trilateral Commission, the Bohemian Club, the Bilderberg Group, and we're just going to kind of go in depth because it is insane how these groups influence our government. And I like the Bohemian Club's one of my favorite. It's so insane, and so I looked up a couple different ones, and I'm doing Trilateral Commission, and it is pretty insane. So really excited about that series. And June we have episode 51. We'll have a bonus episode 52, 53, and Zodiac, Cancer, and we have so much coming up. So hang in there if I'm late, if I'm struggling. I'm having surgery in June. It's a long recovery, so let's maybe I will be able to sit and get stuff done with it. But I'm sorry for rambling. Thank you all for listening. If you want to follow me, I have an Instagram. You can get a sneak peek of the episode on TikTok, or you can view the entire episode and listen to it on YouTube if you'd rather do it that way, or you can get this episode wherever you find your podcasts, and you're obviously listening to it, so you found it. But tell your friends and family, tell everyone, and please go on and rate and review. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you all again, and we'll see you tomorrow with the Gemini Zodiac bonus episode. Thanks. Bye.